Welcome to The Right Angle, the podcast that's all things English and fantasy. Hi, I'm Autumn.
And I'm Abby, and today we're talking about tropes, those reoccurring story elements that can make a story feel familiar, cozy, or maybe a little too predictable.
We'll start by breaking down what tropes are and why writers use them, and then we'll dive into how fantasy in particular has become super trope heavy lately, for better or for worse.
So, first things first, what even is a trope?
It's one of those words that gets tossed around a lot, sometimes like an insult, sometimes like a selling point. But at its core, a trope is just a reoccurring story element. It's not inherently bad.
We'll get into this a little bit later, but I think there has been, especially recently, a rise in the use of tropes in regards to mainstream publishing. So I don't think tropes were always as ingrained into the publishing world as they used to be. But to draw on kind of what we talked about last week with Dr. Hartman, I think tropes came out of the rise of genre fiction. So labeling books as fantasy or mystery or sci-fi, things like that, are already inherently categorizing works. And tropes do that even further.
Definitely. Tropes have existed for as long as I've been a reader, I know for sure. And I can definitely see how the rise of genre fiction really affected book culture in general, because we kind of became a little bit more boxy. We really liked labels. And I think that plays into why tropes have become such a big thing nowadays, because we looked at these reoccurring ideas and story devices and we said, I think there's a pattern here. Multiple authors are using these certain devices and it's becoming a reoccurring thing, so why not name it? And I think that really is kind of how we started getting into tropes and why they are so popular now, because we're at the point where we as readers recognize these tropes. We know these patterns from previous experiences, and so we are able to recognize them, and we are sometimes drawn to them, sometimes pushed away. And I think that's why, as we've talked kind of in our episode about book talk, why labeling books by their tropes is so popular, because people gravitate towards tropes that they like. They like reading things of the same or similar vibes of other books they've read. And so I think that's why labeling books just by tropes right now has become so popular.
So we've kind of talked a little bit about how tropes can be a general definition of what they are. I think it's a lot more practical to give some specific examples. So I think tropes can range from a specific character archetype, such as a morally gray hero, to a specific scene, such as, oh no, there's only one bed. Just about anything could be a trope, as long as it has this little snappy, identifiable name for it and a couple defining characteristics that writers can use in their works. So let's get into some specific tropes.
Yeah, specifically some examples of how they are done in popular movies, because a lot of times the tropes that we see in books are also in movies and TV shows. So one of the first ones that you'll see a lot of times in romance, and nowadays in the romantasy, so romance fantasy subgenre, is enemies to lovers. So that starts out where the two characters absolutely hate each other for whatever reason, but by the end of the story, they fall in love. So some examples of this in movies is How to Lose a Guy in 10 Days, Pride and Prejudice, both in the movie and the book, 10 Things I Hate About You. All of these are examples where the two main characters start off the book disliking each other very strongly. Or maybe even not initially, because I know in How to Lose a Guy in 10 Days, both the two characters were initially attracted to each other and liked each other, but because of other circumstances, basically a bet, they began to do things purposely to annoy the other, and so they started hating each other before eventually falling in love. Another trope that also appears a lot in romance specifically is this idea of fake dating. So the two characters are pretending to be in a relationship for whatever reason that they have, but eventually in this fake dating, they actually start falling in love with each other. So some examples of this are Just Go With It. This is an Adam Sandler movie, and he's pretending to be getting a divorce with his assistant, who is not his wife. They're not in a relationship whatsoever, because he's trying to get with this other girl who thought he was married. And basically, through this fake relationship, they end up falling in love. And then another example of this is The Proposal, which has Sandra Bullock and Ryan Reynolds. And basically in this movie, Sandra Bullock's character is from Canada and her visa is about to expire. And so she recruits her assistant to pretend to be getting married to her so that she can stay in the country. And once again, through this fake relationship, they end up falling in love and actually getting together.
So, if you couldn't tell by now, romance tends to be pretty tropey, but it's not the only one. So, mysteries are also pretty darn tropey. I think a big one that comes up a lot is the everybody did it mystery plot, where you have all these suspects and they all seem to be guilty, and whoever's solving the mystery is having a really hard time, nailing down which one of the suspects did it. But then, twist ending, they all did it. So, spoiler for Agatha Christie books here, but Murder on the Orient Express is, I think, the classic example of this. Another big one that I think is in a lot of mystery, and maybe this also has some overlap into the thriller world, but this is a character trope of the femme fatale, and this is just any super competent, super seductive woman, usually a villain, that kind of tests the main detective or main character because, oh no, she's attractive. But also, horror is very tropey as well. I think one of the biggest horror tropes, especially in slashers, is that of the final girl. So, as the name implies, and as, the way slashers are, there's a killer, whether killer be human or not, and that killer is picking off this cast of characters one by one, and the very last character alive is the final girl, and usually it is a girl, and sometimes she'll take a stand against the killer, sometimes she'll escape, sometimes she won't. But if she does escape, usually there's like a scene where she's like wrapped in a blanket in the back of a cop car, traumatized. But yeah, some examples of this would be Friday the 13th, Nightmare on Elm Street, Scream, obviously. A lot of those classics.
So bringing it back to fantasy and some popular tropes that appear in that genre, I think one of the biggest ones that comes to mind initially is this idea of a prophecy, and specifically a prophecy relating to the main character. You see that a lot in fantasy books, where some mystical oracle delivers a prophecy, or there's a prophecy from a really long time ago that is applicable to the protagonist that they now must follow. And it kind of tells the ending, but usually with like a little bit of a twist.
I think that trope is very interconnected with arguably, I think, one of the most famous fantasy tropes, and that is of the chosen one. So a character who is inherently the hero and inherently must save the world, stop some form of evil, but they are specifically chosen by some outside force and they have to rise to that occasion. Sometimes it's explicitly stated in stories that they are the chosen one, but sometimes it's mostly just implied.
So some examples of this, a really famous one being Star Wars. So a little bit of a spoiler for Star Wars for anyone who might not have seen it. So there is initial prophecy that is put out that there's going to be this chosen one who's going to restore balance to the world and to the Force. And I think it's still up for debate. I'm not super knowledgeable on like the really heavy lore of Star Wars, but initially it's thought that Anakin Skywalker is the one who applies the prophecy, but then, he turns to the dark side, and then his son, Luke Skywalker, takes up the mantle as the chosen one and ends up restoring balance. And I think there's this whole theory that actually it was Anakin who restored balance to the Force, even though he did turn to the dark side, because he had this bit of a redemption at the end. But another example of this is also Harry Potter. So Harry Potter, the boy who lived, is prophesized that he is going to be the one who's going to stop Voldemort and, save Hogwarts and whatnot, and he ends up doing that.
I think it's really important to distinguish with Harry Potter. It is very obvious that he is the chosen one. I mean, the minute he enters the wizarding world, everyone is clamoring to tell him, "You're Harry Potter. You are the chosen one," But with the original 3 Star Wars movies,
no, because it's not explicitly stated that Anakin or Luke is the prophesized hero, which is why there is that theory that Anakin still is.
And I think that's a good example of a piece of media that uses a trope in an interesting and different way. So, Autumn, what is your favorite and least favorite trope, now that we've kind of gotten the definition out of the way?
My favorite trope by far, and you can tell this by looking at my bookshelf and how many of these books I own, is 100% enemies to lovers. I am a sucker for it in whatever form it comes. I just love the tension and the witty commentary and remarks that come out of it. And I just love the relationships that are formed because they started off hating each other and now they love each other. It's just my favorite. I love it so much. Hard to come up with least favorites because I don't read them because I don't like them. And so I'm like, oh shoot, what is my least favorite? It would be after one that I've read maybe like once. And then I was like, I don't like it, and I just avoid it. So my least favorite trope, or at least one of them, which I know is not true for everybody, and I acknowledge this, it's just tropes are a personal thing. It's what you like and what you don't like. And one that I don't like is love triangles, which my sister absolutely loves love triangles. She loves to watch shows like The Summer I Turned Pretty or My Life with the Walter Boys. And I just find love triangles unrealistic and often annoying. But that is just a me thing because I don't like 2 guys fawning over 1 girl. Oh no, which will she choose? It irritates me. And so whenever I'm reading a book and that appears, it just makes me so uncomfortable. But I think a lot of times that's because the love triangles I have read haven't been handled well. I think this is true for most tropes, is if you handle a trope well and you do something interesting with it, then it is good. But if you do it bad, it's really bad.
Or if you do it super, super cliche, if you do it exactly with every single detail of that trope. I wouldn't say love triangles are my least favorite, but I really don't like it when both of the guys are kind of samey, and there's a clear choice and you already know which one is the good one and which one is the bad one, and one is a clear villain, and it's not that in-depth or interesting. I think a lot of those popped up in 2010s YA after the Hunger Games, kind of how we talked about the Hunger Games being the old blueprint. Even predating the Hunger Games, I mean, one of the most famous love triangle pieces of media is Twilight. And unless I'm enjoying Twilight ironically from a humorous standpoint, if I'm like actually trying to unironically enjoy it, it just hurts me. Circling back to my favorite and least favorite trope, by far my favorite is found family. We haven't explained that one yet. So, found family is basically this cast of characters that are not blood family, and they're usually kind of thrown together via circumstances, but they grow really close and become this like very strong group of friends, so strong that they are almost family, hence the name found family. And I don't know, I really enjoy it when it's done really well. I think a really good example of this is the Six of Crows duology. Stepping outside of the realm of fantasy, a lot of sitcom casts that aren't like a family sitcom, such as Friends or How I Met Your Mother, shows like that, those I would consider found family. Casts of characters like Guardians of the Galaxy, that's a really strong example of found family. I just really enjoy found family because of all the little individual dynamics it comes with. But I think my least favorite trope, so circling back to our book talk episode, we kind of talked about how a lot of, and we'll get into this more later, but we kind of talked about how a lot of books are marketed via their tropes and how a lot of books have the same tropes in them, especially romantasy. And something that I am very tired of seeing is the it kind of has a silly name. This is the name that Book Talk has dubbed it. So I hate this trope so much, and I hate the name too, but the like shadow daddy trope. So basically, this trope is a character trope, and it is the male love interest, usually in a romantasy book. And they're usually this brooding, super powerful, super morally gray character who is like super obsessed and devoted to the female protagonist. And granted, before it became this like super popular trope, I was okay with seeing it, but now because it's become this like blueprint and staple of the romantasy subgenre, it is everywhere, and I feel like every single male main character has to be morally gray, has to be edgy, has to like sometimes even be borderline abusive to the main character, and then that's like romanticized. And also, usually they're like 500 years old or something, because as we already know, people like copying Sarah J. Maas, and that's a thing that she gravitates towards. And usually he also has this like dark backstory, and he's emotionally closed until, you know, the main character gets him to open up. And it's just become a very samey staple of this very popular fantasy subgenre. And there's a lot of online discourse about it, and I am just tired of seeing it. So we've kind of already talked about this, but I think we are going to move on and start talking about the state of tropes today and how Book Talk has kind of influenced tropes into becoming more popular. So I feel as though we've kind of moved from using tropes as these creative tools to heavy marketing labels. So let's start talking about how tropes have taken over the book world, and especially how fantasy has leaned into them.
I do think we talked a lot about this on a previous episode, so if you haven't watched, go check it out, because we're going to kind of gloss over a little bit of like the book talk stuff. We're not going to get super heavy into it because we did get a little heavy into it in a previous episode, but we are going to talk about it a little bit because it had such a big influence on tropes. And part of that is because we're labeling books by tropes now. It's become a thing because of book talk, because of the short form and the get it out quick, do it in an engaging, grappling way where people understand as fast as possible. We are labeling books by tropes. for convenience, but also because, as said previously, we as people understand patterns, we recognize them, and tropes are just patterns because they are reoccurring ideas. So when someone says, hey, you should check out this book, it's enemies to lovers, we automatically know kind of the vibe of the book going into it and whether or not we're going to like it.
Absolutely. And I feel as though this is a double-edged sword. On one hand, writers and publishers are able to connect readers to the exact type of fantasy that they love. You know, for example, someone like Autumn, who really loves enemies to lovers, can find that so much more easily because usually it is straight up written on the dust jacket of the book. But also, the other edge of the sword, I feel as though sometimes books are being written with these tropes in mind, just to kind of fulfill this marketing checklist so people will pick up their book. And instead of these tropes organically arising and being there because the story needs it, they're being shoehorned in because, oh, well, you know, this popular book talker has really made Only One Bed popular, or Shadow Daddies popular, or straight up other authors have made this popular. Like we kind of talked about in our book talk episode how ACOTAR has kind of become the blueprint for romantasy as a whole. I really think you can see this with tropes. I really think a lot of romantasy has pulled influence from the Fae Court. Not just the mythology of the Fae Court, but the way Sarah J. Maas wrote the Fae Court. And, you know, morally gray love interest and enemies to lovers and the soulmates trope. I mean, it is very chock full of tropes. And I'm not going to say that nothing good has come out of this because I'm sure Autumn can tell you a lot of fun books and great books have come out of this. But I also feel as though a lot of lazy cash grab type books have come out of this trope craze.
In my opinion, tropes work well when someone is doing something new, when they're taking a trope and putting their own spin on it. Tropes don't work well if we are just following verbatim what other people have done without any creativity and without any ingenuity added to these tropes. Tropes aren't meant to be a blueprint, they're meant to be scaffolding.
I love that. That's such a good analogy because I think a lot of people lately have been treating them as a blueprint just to get, you know, book talk talking about them. But the really good ones that hold on for more than, you know, a couple months do treat it as scaffolding and do build upon it. That's something that we are going to talk a lot about next week, where we are going to talk about subverting tropes. A little sneak peek for that. Both of us being me and Autumn, our major fantasy projects that we're writing right now have really heavy trope subversions. So we're going to talk about our own personal experience with that and also how other writers have found success subverting these classic tropes.
But real quickly, I did want to touch a little bit on our own writing and tropes because I know I can spot some tropes that I incorporate and not ones that I completely subvert. So I want to get Abby's input on this too because I also know she has a couple too that appear in her novella. But for me, a trope that I have incorporated is this idea of a hidden royal. So basically, that's a trope that appears mostly in fantasy, but it also can appear in other genres too. And basically, it's the idea where the main character or one of the main characters, or even sometimes a side character, is royalty. And they are not necessarily like first in line, but they can be. And they're just kind of hiding out, or it's like a reveal. And like you turn and this person you find out through this journey, through this story, is royalty, and that has some significance to the plot or the story.
I feel like sometimes that character will know their royalty and they'll be hiding that. Sometimes they don't know, and that's something that is revealed to them.
Yeah, so in my book, the way it is the female main character does know that she is royalty going into this story, but the male main character doesn't know. And so it's a secret that she's purposely keeping because it has significance and relevant to the plot and the world. And so it is a trope that I have definitely incorporated because I like it. And I think it adds to the story. And it is a very prominent part of the plot. And so including it was not just because I wanted to include a little royal because I think it'd be fun, but because my main plot heavily relies on her being royalty.
I kind of struggled to think about what tropes my fantasy novella has because it's just so weird. But I think one that is pretty straightforward is like a scene trope of like a ballroom dance. And this scene is very near and dear to my heart. It's something that came out of an interesting bit of inspiration. So my freshman year in wind ensemble, we played this like very interestingly scored tango piece, and I couldn't help but just imagine my two main characters dancing together, and one thing led to another, and it became a very important scene. And so through this scene, a lot of character details are revealed to each other. It's kind of a bonding moment before, you know, the crap hits the fan plot-wise, but I think in comparison to other ballroom scenes, I think it's pretty straightforward. I think dancing scenes in fantasy lend themselves to characters talking and revealing things about themselves and growing closer, because dancing can be quite intimate. So that's my trope.
So another really common fantasy trope that I've incorporated, specifically fantasy character trope, is the idea of having an assassin. So my male main character is an assassin. And part of the reason I did that was just because I like that trope a lot. That one is genuinely one where I was like, I think I want to incorporate an assassin because I think they're cool and I think they're fun to read about. And also it adds a bit of tension to the story, and it also helps move the plot along having someone who is fairly competent, which will make sense when we start talking about like us defying tropes next episode. It'll make sense why I need a competent character. But just know he is very central to moving the plot along because he is knowledgeable in weird ways about a lot of different things. And so having an assassin in a story, for me, yes, I could have done something else because I did for a really long time think about other things that this character could be before ultimately being like, nah, I like him as this. It's a little bit of a treat to myself because I like the trope, but also it's helpful and it's beneficial to the story.
I relate to that so much with my ballroom scene. I love a good dance scene, and I feel like writing it has been my little treat to myself. I think all of this is to say that as much as we don't like some of the directions that tropes are going, as far as, you know, people using them like a blueprint instead of scaffolding, we do use tropes in our own writing. And with the way fantasy is today, it's just an inherent part of it. So tropes aren't the enemy, it's just how we use them.
A trope can be a crutch or it can be a creative springboard depending on the writer.
And at the end of the day, readers love what feels both familiar and new. Like they've come home, but the house has a few new rooms.
We'd love to hear what tropes you love or hate, so tell us over on our Instagram or in the comments.
Well, that's it from The Right Angle, where we know the real magic isn't just in the story, it's in those who write it too.
Until next time, write boldly, read unapologetically,
And stay weird.